Good afternoon, everyone. Happy Halloween, and welcome to P&P Live. I'm Brad Graham, the co-owner of Politics and Prose, along with my wife, Lisa Muscatine, and we're very pleased to have with us this afternoon veteran journalist Terence Smith. We'll be talking about his new memoir, 4 Wars, 5 Presidents, a reporter's journey from Jerusalem to Saigon to the White House. A couple of brief housekeeping notes first, though. To post a question at any point during the discussion, just click on the Q&A icon at the bottom of the screen. And in the chat column, you'll find a link for purchasing copies of 4 Wars, 5 Presidents. Now, looking back at Terry Smith's journalism career, it's probably shorter to list the stories he didn't cover than the ones that he did over nearly 5 decades. As the son of a prominent sports writer father, Red Smith, Terry has the news business in his blood. After starting with a job covering local politics in Connecticut, he joined the New York Herald Tribune and then the New York Times, where he spent 20 years holding some of the best assignments at the paper: foreign correspondent, diplomatic correspondent, chief White House correspondent, and editor on both the foreign and metro desks. Then in 1985, he shifted to broadcast, joining CBS News, where he covered the White House and reported stories for CBS Sunday Morning. In 1998, he turned to public television, founding and leading the media unit at the Newshour with Jim Lehrer, and winning a number of awards for media criticism and analysis. 8 years ago, Terry was inducted into the Professional Journalists Hall of Fame. His many years in journalism coincided with some extraordinary transformations in the news business, a period during which the business became more vital than ever, but also more troubled. On the one hand, people today have more information available to them through more sources than ever before. On the other, it's now much harder to discern what's true and what isn't. I know Terry has some thoughts on this, along with some great stories to tell about what journalism was like in his day. We'll be in conversation this afternoon with Elisabeth Bumiller, another very experienced journalist who, as an assistant managing editor of the New York Times, currently heads the paper's Washington bureau. She's been with the Times since 1985, and before that, reported for the Washington Post and the Miami Herald. Elisabeth also has authored 3 books: biography of Condoleezza Rice, a work on women in India, and another on a year in the life of a Japanese housewife and her family. So, Terry and Elisabeth, the screen is yours.
Thank you, Brad. That's terrific. Elisabeth, hi.
Hi, thank you, Brad. Hi, Terry. I just want to thank you for asking me to moderate. It's a great privilege. I should tell our audience, I first met Terry in around 1981, when I was actually, dating a White House correspondent for the New York Times, Steve Wiseman, when I was working for the Washington Post. So I was a girlfriend of the Washington Bureau of the New York Times. Anyway, I married that guy, Steve Wiseman, and we just celebrated the 38th wedding anniversary. So anyway, and I just want to tell Terry how much I enjoyed the book. It really brought me back to some of the stories I remember myself, some I don't know, and it was extremely, it's a very readable book. It's a very thoughtful book, and so congratulations.
Well, thank you, Elisabeth. You were, of course, when we first met, a mere child.
Well, actually, I was 23.
Barely out of diapers.
Yeah.
And remarkably advanced for your age.
Well, let me just start with some of the, again, the book opens in June of 1967. Terry has just arrived in Jerusalem as a very green 27-year-old foreign correspondent for the New York Times. 10 days later, you found yourself covering the Six-Day War. And I was really struck by the description you had. You described what the Western Wall was like. You were at the Western Wall as Israel emerged triumphant from that war. I just want you to talk about what that scene was like. Very
well, I will, Elisabeth. Thank you. It was an extraordinary moment, but you have to back up a little bit, just 2 days in advance on June 4th, 1967 is a Sunday in Jerusalem. And as you say, I am a brand new foreign correspondent who knows really nothing about Israel or foreign correspondence or anything else. Anyway, we geniuses in the foreign press decided to believe Moshe Dayan, then defense minister in Israel, when he said in a press conference that that Israel was going to give Egypt and diplomacy more time. Well, that was the afternoon of the 4th, and of course, famously, the attack began in the morning of the 5th. So my advice to everybody is, when you hear a political figure, a military figure even more, an Israeli even more, say they're going to give diplomacy more time, watch out. Go to the shelters right away, because you certainly shouldn't believe them the way we did. The war was launched. I did cover the epic Battle of Jerusalem, which took place over basically the next 48 hours. And along with the late Jim Farron of the New York Times, went into East Jerusalem right behind the Israeli troops on the morning of the 7th of June. And it was a hot, dry morning. And we went around the old city, and we came in through the Lion's Gate and up to the Temple Mount, known to the Palestinians as the Noble Sanctuary. And we got up there, and it was an extraordinary moment. Israel had taken over the holiest place in Judaism, to which its people had not been admitted for 19 years because it was controlled by Jordan. And it was the first time, for the record, if you're counting, that Jews controlled the entire old city in 2,000 years. So it was a bit of a moment. And it was very interesting to the different reactions of the Israeli troops. Some, the Orthodox, the observant, were immensely moved by it and appreciated the religious and historic significance of the moment. Others, not observant, not interested, desperately hot on a hot day, were looking for shade, literally in the shade of the Dome of the Rock. And that's where they rested. And we were there, and so it was a dramatic moment. Then, as history will show, the soldiers gathered at the wall. Some danced literally and sang. Others put messages into the wall. Still others ignored the whole thing. It was a very good reflection of the breakdown in Israeli society between the Orthodox and the observant and the non-observant, put it that way. So it was quite a moment.
So interesting. But then a year later, it's June 1968, and it's June 9, 1968, and you get word from the American ambassador to Israel that Robert F. Kennedy, whose campaign for Senate you had covered in 1964 during New York Senate, the senator from New York, had been assassinated in Los Angeles by somebody named Sirhan Sirhan. And it turns out that his father, you were told, lived in a Palestinian village near Jerusalem. And that is an amazing story. So what do you do? You're now the New York Times foreign correspondent for a little more than a year. So what do you do?
A whole year, right?
Right.
You know the old saying, you know everything after 6 months, and after a year, you know how little you know in another country. In that case, yes. I was attending a reception at the residence of the ambassador at the time. And he said, well, you know, not only have we identified Sirhan Sirhan Jr., but Sirhan Sirhan Sr. lives just outside of Jerusalem in a village. He told me where, and I thanked him very much. And I went immediately back to Jerusalem and got an interpreter, which I didn't need in the end, and went to find him. And by the time I got there, it was 10 o'clock at night, and the house was dark. So I went up to the steps and I rapped on the door, and he came to the door. I explained who I was, and he, Arab hospitality, he not only welcomes us in, he insists on making coffee. And so now it's 10:30 at night. We sit down at his kitchen table. And I asked him what he knew of the events. Did he know that Robert Kennedy had been assassinated? And he said, yes, he did know. It was terrible. Kennedy, he said, could have been president, could have been a great president. He had heard that. I asked him if he had heard that the assassin was caught right there on the spot. And he said, yes, I know. I heard that. I heard that on the radio. And I said, did you, and I found this a little odd. And so I said, did you hear the name of the assassin? And he said, no, actually, I went to bed and didn't listen any further. So I pushed my reporter's notebook across the kitchen table to him and asked him to write down the names of his sons. He had 5 sons. And he writes them down one after the other. And when he writes the 4th name, Sirhan Jr., I put my finger on that name and I said, that's the assassin. That's the person they've taken. I'm not sure he believed me at first, but he could see I was serious.
He had no idea where you were going with this?
He had no idea. And he was incredibly shocked. And his emotions went from left to right, one side to the other. He said, for example, his first answer was, Sirhan, no, not a chance that he would have done it. He was the best of the boys. I had the highest hopes for him. And then he would swing over and say, and he said, but if he did it, he should hang. And so it's back and forth, a very erratic guy. And this goes on till midnight. And I went back to Jerusalem and wrote the story. But the next day I went and interviewed Sirhan Jr.'s headmaster at the school that he went to in East Jerusalem. And he remembered him very well, said he was a good student. He was a bright boy. But he said, the father was very abusive and beat the mother and the father and the boys, excuse me. And that's why the mother bundled up the boys and took them to the United States. And that's why Sirhan Jr. was in the Ambassador Hotel in Los Angeles when he was at that time. So it was quite extraordinary. A postscript was that I had had some correspondence with Robert F. Kennedy, whom I'd really come to admire. I was skeptical of him at first, but I came to believe that his commitment to civil rights and racial justice was the real deal. So he had written a couple of letters, I had written back, and the last one I got from it arrived in Jerusalem 2 days after he was assassinated.
Yeah, what a story. What a story.
Yeah.
I should say, I want to move to Vietnam now. I should say that the 4 wars, just if we're just to keep track, that Terry covered, the 6-Day War we've talked about, the Vietnam War, which you're about to get to, the 1973 Yom Kippur War, and one not as well known, but still a very hairy war, the Turkish invasion of Cyprus in 1974. Those are the 4 wars. The 5 presidents, we're about to get to them: Nixon, Carter, Reagan, Clinton, and George W. Bush. So I was interested you were in Vietnam in 1968 to 1970 for the Times, and you took your then wife Anne there and your infant daughter Elizabeth. And I was surprised by that, especially since mortars were hitting your front lawn. It seems to be regularly.
Well, yeah, I didn't know that. But
Saigon, right.
The security situation in Saigon by this time, the very beginning of 1969, when they came, was such that I thought, reached a conclusion with my wife that it was safe enough. So I rented a house on Winzhou Street, a lovely street in Saigon, which is and the house was right across the way from the presidential palace, which had a big contingent of troops there protecting the palace. I thought, well, they'll protect the palace, they'll protect me. And just down the street, just down Winzhou Street, 2 blocks, were the twin spires of the Saigon Cathedral, which is a big landmark in Saigon. So I figured I had the presidential palace, I had the Lord just down the street. What could go wrong? Well, it was about the third or fourth night when the first mortars landed actually in the street in front of the house. And we would bundle up Elizabeth, who was an infant, and take her underneath the concrete steps. And she loved it. She would say, boom, boom. I think they were her first words, actually. And so that's the way we learned a life lesson, right? Don't trust the obvious. Don't take it so literally. In fact, the mortars, we were never injured. We lived there for 18 months. We were not injured. And the C-130s would fly over the Viet Cong positions and suppress the fire very rapidly.
Were you at the time, what was your view of the war? I mean, did you feel it like it was lost? Did you feel like
Absolutely.
the United States was making a terrible mistake? I mean, was it, so it was futile?
Even before I got there in December of 1968, it seemed to me, if not a lost cause, an eventual stalemate. I could not see it unraveling. I couldn't see an outcome that was in any way similar to what was being said in Washington or by the military leaders and by Ambassador Ellsworth Bunker, fine man, but he was kidding himself about what was going to happen. And I want to read you one thing I interviewed just before I got there in November of 1968. Think about the date. I interviewed Prince Norodom Sihanouk, then the head of Cambodia. And this is exactly what he said, 2 sentences. I'll quote: "You will be forced to take your troops and leave Vietnam. You cannot block the majority will. You cannot stop the reunification and, yes, the communization of Vietnam. The majority of the people want to be with Ho Chi Minh. There is nothing you can do about it. It would be wise to withdraw and let the Vietnamese settle their own problems themselves." That's November 17. I put it in the New York Times, in the issue, Sunday, New York Times of November 17th, 1968. And
You could have said that about more current wars as well.
I mean, put the word Afghanistan in there.
Right.
Instead of Vietnam, and you would see it. But this was tens of thousands of casualties on the U.S. side.
Well, that was what was, so you write about there were 500 casualties a week, and the U.S. had 50,000 American troops there, which again,
500,000.
500,000, excuse me, 500,000 supposed to. And at the height in Afghanistan, there were never more than, there was about 100,000 plus U.S. troops in Afghanistan. So this was, when you look at the death toll in Vietnam, it still was 50,000 dead, I believe, over that many.
58,000, that's right.
Let's,
just to finish that point, that the Sihanouk point should not be lost. Not in Afghanistan, for the U.S., for the U.S. policymakers. That point should not be lost. That there are limits to the way we can project our military power and its effectiveness. And when we entertain the next adventure, we ought to think about that.
Let me move on to 1970. This was amusing to me as a Washington bureau chief. You come back from Vietnam, you arrive in the Washington bureau as a diplomatic correspondent covering the State Department, foreign policy, American diplomacy. And I was, first of all, amused that it was a 45-member bureau. We're up to 135 now. But wow. Well, it's not, there's about 60 plus who work for Washington. The others are part of just the expansion of the New York Times. It's the audio team, the visual team, but nonetheless, we're packed in there. But I was very amused that when the Secretary of State would give a press conference, the gentlemen of the New York Times, it'd be 3, 4, or 5 of you would all pile into a limousine that was organized by James Scotty Reston, and you would go over and cover it. And on the way back, he would decide that you needed to do 5 stories on this one press conference. That is very different from what we do today.
Yes, that's right. I
can't get over that.
I mean, Secretary Blinken would give a news conference, and I don't know if you'd cover it, of course, but it would, it'd be a line or two in a story on foreign policy, but it was a big deal then.
And why was that?
The centrality in the mind, I guess, of the collective mind of the New York Times about American power and its role abroad. And of course, it was articulated then by the Secretary of State. What you will find later in the book is this was to the exquisite annoyance of one Henry Kissinger,
right,
who was the National Security Advisor, who wanted to be the number one voice in American foreign policy, and was terribly jealous of William P. Rogers, the then Secretary of State, and kept denying. And one time I have a quote somewhere here, or maybe you have it, where it's actually in the tapes, the famous Nixon Oval Office tapes, right? And I had written a story that had annoyed Nixon. I've forgotten even what it was. Doesn't matter. And but here's Kissinger trying to wriggle out of it, and wriggle out of any authorship, I guess. And here's the exact quote: Kissinger, first of all, Terence Smith never calls my staff. Not true. He has never done it in all the years we've been here. Doubly not true. Secondly, my staff is on additional instructions not to return any calls from the New York Times. Well, that was true, but largely ignored by his staff. And Nixon in the tapes says, that's right. He buys it. And Kissinger says, quote, so that's out of the question. In other words, it's not me, boss. It's
but he was a phenomenal leaker, right?
Yeah, he was.
So now you leave the Times for CBS, and I was amused by this story at one of the summits between Reagan and Gorbachev. You were in Reykjavik, and you said a remote house. By the way, I've seen that house. It's not that remote, but I think when it's cold outside, it does feel remote. Oh. It's on the edge of downtown, but downtown's very small. But anyway, they have it there as a shrine to this great moment anyway, I was very amused. You were freezing outside, waiting to find out what was going on inside, had no idea what was happening there, obviously. And a Secret Service agent comes out and holds up 7 fingers, and then he holds up 3 fingers. And the correspondents are in an uproar. What is going on? What was this signal? And you asked another Secret Service agent, what is going on in there? And
he said, it means Redskins 7, Giants 3.
Right.
It was a Sunday afternoon, and that showed you where their focus was.
Right.
But that summit went on for hours, and it did get quite cold outside that guest house, which is near the ocean.
Right, and, right on the border.
They don't call it Iceland for nothing.
No. So let me ask. You talk about Carter, what a smart man he was. He had very good ideas, but that he failed. He didn't understand that you have to, really lobby Congress. He just thought, this is a smart idea. Why aren't they accepting this? He didn't have any sense really of Washington politics. But I'm curious, of the 5 presidents, this is a tough one because reporters, why not? I'll ask you anyway. Who do you think was the most effective president? Let me ask you that. I won't say best, but most effective.
Well, you've got to pick highlights for them. For Nixon, it's obviously China, right. The opening to China, and the disaster is the Vietnam War and his own involvement in Watergate. So there's a high and a low, as there is with all these. With Carter, surely the Camp David Accords, which led to peace between Egypt and Israel, which he negotiated painstakingly, must be a high point. The low point, of course, was the Iran hostage crisis, which effectively doomed his presidency. 444 days, you had 52 Americans, diplomats hostage in Tehran, and released only on 20th of January, 1981, did they leave Iranian airspace.
Never very well.
When Ronald Reagan was inaugurated, sworn in. So there are highs and lows for all these guys, you know. They did, and they were all guys. They still are all guys. But with Clinton was, you know, he's a brilliant man, and he worked incredibly hard, and he accomplished a great deal. And then he got up there one famous day, looked into the camera, and said, "I did not have sex with that woman, Miss Lewinsky." And his presidency was forever marked. And yes, he was impeached, but he was reelected. But you know, his legacy, his obit, you know, it'll be pretty high in there. And Reagan was incredible. I mean, he lived his Hollywood movies. He lived the roles he played. And there's some wonderful stories about that. But he could communicate brilliantly. And ultimately, I don't believe he achieved the things he set out to achieve. He wanted a smaller government. Well, it was larger when he left. He wanted to reduce the deficit. It was larger when he left. So, I mean, history, I think, will be harsh on him. But the great achievement was 4 summit meetings with Mikhail Gorbachev that led to not only to the intermediate nuclear arms treaty, but also effectively the end of the Cold War. So, you know, that's a pretty good credit. And George W. Bush comes along. He runs for president, I think, because his name was Bush, and because it somehow was expected of him. And he wanted to outdo his father. And I mean, this is my view. Not, I can't prove any of this. And I was there in the barn in Iowa, where he declared himself a candidate for president. And I watched him talk, standing up on a stage surrounded by hay bales, and describing himself as a compassionate conservative. That was his rubric. But I remember looking at him, wondering, why is this man running? He does not have federal experience. He does not, have the equipment, frankly. And yet he not only ran, he won, and he went on. And I think he was struggling to find an event or a direction for his presidency, because he had largely subcontracted it to Dick Cheney and Don Rumsfeld and Paul Wolfowitz and people like that, who took him down the road into the war in Iraq. And it was a colossal blunder, and it is his legacy. Not one that he wants, I'm sure. But there was I did get a laugh about a month ago. I don't know if you read it. George W., who was an immensely decent man. Mm-hmm. I mean, he is a caring, considerate, compassionate individual. He was asked, apparently, somewhere, what he thought of the presidency of Donald J. Trump. And Trump was president at the time. And apparently, according to this report, Bush chuckled and said, "And just to think, I used to be the dumb one. And so I give him credit for a very nice sense of humor.
So let me ask just a few more questions. You talked about the blessing and the curse of being the son of a very famous father, Red Smith, who was a brilliant sports writer and won a Pulitzer Prize for his sports writing at the age of 70. So, and he obviously was one reason you went into the business. But what were what were the blessings? What were the curses of that?
Well, curse is a strong word, but I saw this man whom I love very much. Hell, he went to the ballpark to work. He went to the racetrack. He went to the fight camps. This is not a bad way to make a living. So I went down and got a job on a newspaper. He did not push me into that at all. Said, you should do whatever you want. But at this point, by the time I get knocking on doors at newspapers in New York City, he is the most widely read sports columnist in the country. He is about to win the Pulitzer, the first sports writer to win it for commentary. And so he's on the cover of Newsweek and whatnot.
Yeah.
So he's a big figure. What does that do for me? It opens doors. There's no question about that. I mean, it provides opportunities. I knew people at the New York Times, for example, because and through him. But it also is a challenge because people inevitably compare you to him, even though you want to carve or you try to carve your own path. In my case, news versus sports, overseas versus at home. But let me tell you, the net was very positive in that relationship. He was incidentally a great editor of my stuff, in the sense that he read everything I wrote. And if we could, he would get in touch with me the next day if he liked something, and he'd get in touch with me if he didn't like something.
Well, it sounds great. Let me ask you, was there anything you would change about your career looking back? I mean, it was an amazing career. It's been an amazing,
I mean, it's serendipity all the way, with a couple of exceptions. I really wanted to go overseas from the very beginning. And when I went to, that's why, honestly, I moved to the New York Times. New York Times had 38 bureaus or something overseas. The New York Herald Tribune, where I was working, had 2. And the editor told me he was seriously considering which one to close. And the paper folded a year and a half later. So that was very much impetus for me. I had a great wanderlust. My parents had taken me overseas when I was young, and it made a big impression on me. I was really impressed with and fascinated by the way other people live their lives, solve their problems, work out issues. I thought that was fascinating. That's why I wanted to go overseas from the beginning. So would I have changed that? Absolutely not. If I had been a corporation man, I suppose I would have remained what you are, an editor at the New York Times, although you're higher ranked than I ever was. And I would have attempted to go further up the corporate ladder. But I miss the action of writing and reporting. And I don't know, do you?
Of course. Yeah. I mean, I have, doesn't mean I'd like to get back to it someday. Absolutely. You're
running a very big operation right now.
Big operation, yes.
And I imagine it's incredibly demanding. Now, I didn't write very much in this about a 6th president, Donald Trump.
Right.
We've got that from Bob Woodward and Robert Costa and others, but they don't need me for that. But I will say this about, I knew Trump. I met Trump back in the 80s.
Mhm.
when he was sort of a New York playboy, and you didn't take it seriously at all. And I was astounded that he could not only run, but win and be elected president, never having filled a single public office at any level.
Well, the world, many of us were astounded. Yes.
I mean, it was I don't think of the presidency, Elizabeth, as a starter job
No.
in politics, and yet he did it. So on the one hand, his presidency, or his election rather, was kind of a modern electoral miracle. On the other hand, his presidency was a disaster. And now the notion that he might run again and conceivably be reelected again, it's hard to fathom.
Let me ask you this, because we're talking about Donald Trump in the current day. What things have changed a lot since you were at the New York Times, or even at CBS News. What do you make of what you see today about journalism? And if young people ask you, should I go into journalism, what do you tell them?
Well, I tell them do it, but I tell them you have to be able to do everything. You need to know how to report, how to write. You should be able to broadcast, or at least do audio, if not video, or probably both. You need to do it, and social media, and you need to do it all. Overall, as Brad Graham suggested in his introduction there, we've never had more information at our fingertips. And yet sorting out fact from fiction is an increasingly difficult job. That's the job that you editors were supposed to do. You were the gatekeepers. Well, now that since the fire hose of social media is such, the individual reader or viewer is the gatekeeper. He or she has to decide what's true and what's false.
Well,
And that's an obligation.
Would you want to go into the business today, knowing what you know? Would you be interested in this business today?
Absolutely.
Oh, okay.
Because in many ways it's more immediate, more electric, more and extremely important in my view, particularly on the local news level, and diminishing. These so-called local news deserts are occurring around the country, and it's a problem. So, I grew up from my father, and more broadly, with the notion that keeping people advised, alert, informed as to what's going on around them is not a bad way to spend your time. It is a useful pursuit. And all I would say to the young person coming into the trade now is, you're just going to have to do it all, every bit of it, in every medium, in every way. And yet it won't be boring.
That is true. It's not boring. We are now at about time for asking questions from, I see we have some questions from the audience. So let me click on here. Anonymous attendee. Okay. Here. Yeah. So this is the question I just asked. Given how much journalism has changed, what advice would you offer to someone thinking of becoming a journalist today? Well, here's the rest of the question. I didn't ask. How would you suggest someone get into business? I can answer that.
You broke up just a bit there at the end, but how would I suggest someone to get into the
yeah, how would you tell somebody what's the best way of getting into the journalism business today?
I am of the view still that you have to learn basic reporting, and that's born of curiosity, and you have to hone that skill. And to do it is something special. And you must learn that first before you learn anything else. And then you better learn how to write it and report it and maybe articulate on air or, live. So that's what you have to do.
Okay, let me ask some more questions here. What were the most different things about being a broadcast journalist for CBS compared with working as a print journalist for the New York Times?
Well, it's a different medium, of course, and you have to learn. You write differently. You write to the picture, not over it. You condense your thoughts and time and everything else. You increase your focus. You've got to put yourself in the place of the viewer and tell the story in a way that it will come across to that viewer. And so it's fascinating. It has, however, on a breaking story, immense capabilities, especially live television, that newspapers have to come along. Now, today, of course, I'm one of the ancients who still receives the New York Times in print, in newsprint every morning on my doorstep. But I realize that is a shrinking number. And
I can tell you the numbers. Well, the numbers are very good. We have the really good numbers. We have 8 million paying subscribers. Now that's huge. When you were at the Times, it was 1 million. So
1.3 million on Sunday.
Right. Well, now I believe now during the week, it's 400,000, and Sunday is still 1 million, if not more. So, but 8 million is huge, and we're growing. So that's the good news. And of course, I still get the New York Times in print on my front steps every day. But by the time you get it, there is a whole other, if you look online on your phone or on your laptop, there is a whole other world that's happened. So what you get in print is obviously, 12 hours old, and what you get on in the morning is very fresh. So
the old cliche is the first draft of history.
Right.
Well,
right.
It's the first draft, and the second is on its way by the time the newspaper gets to you on your doorstep.
But especially when there's events happening overseas and in Europe, like with the Biden now in Europe and Glasgow, on his way to Glasgow, you'll get the latest news tomorrow morning, and you will not get it in print. Okay.
Let me turn, before you go, turn the question back to you.
Yeah, sure.
The young person who is thinking about getting in the business. Mm-hmm. What do you tell them?
Well, here's the problem we have. First I tell them there's a problem that there used to be all these local papers you came up with. I started the Racine Journal Times, the Green Bay Press Gazette, the Naples Bureau, the West Coast Bureau of the Miami Herald. I covered City Hall, police, county commission, drug busts in the Everglades in Florida. And those papers they're shadows of themselves, many of them, or they don't exist. So basically the way to start these days is online. Politico, people start in, but again, it's hard to find a place to start, frankly. We tend to hire, from like our fellows. We now have a year-long fellow program instead of summer internships. So we have people who come and stay with us for a year. And they tend to come from you need to work for your college newspaper, basically. I tend to look people who have been the editors of big college dailies, like the big state schools, tend to have a lot of have good beginning experience, and I look at their clips from those places because I figured they weren't edited particularly, thoroughly, and you can get a good sense of somebody. So, the Michigan Daily, the University of Florida Alligator, those are good places to start, and then you build from there. We hire from Politico, USA Today, the Washington Post is pretty big, obviously, but it's our big competitor.
What fascinates me is when there are people leave organizations like the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Wall Street Journal and go to social media, go to Politico or BuzzFeed or Vox.
There's not that much. Yeah, there's not that much going from the Times to Politico? Not too much.
No, it's not a great, we're not talking great numbers here. The fact that it would ever happen or happen at
Well,
all is my point, that it shows the status of some of the online news sites, and I guess the importance of them, and also the financial capabilities.
right. But I, I'm biased here, but I tend to think that there's, I can't think of anybody who's gone to Politico. We tend to hire from Politico. I can't think of anybody recently who's gone from the Times to Politico. Forgive me if I forgot somebody. I can think of one person. He came back. He just came back.
Sarah Swisher.
No, Paul Volpe just came back to the Times. He went from the Times.
But anyway, I think the point stands
My
up.
point is, we don't, we still are an attractive place to work, despite the fact that we're, the New York Times. I mean, if people want to work at the New York Times still, just like when they were there in your day. Okay. So let's see, here's the questions. It's not so hard for many people. It's gotten so hard for many people to figure out what is true and what is not, and what they have read or see in the news. What advice do you have for them about how to discern fact from fiction?
Well, that's the whole issue of
Right.
media literacy, of you, the consumer of print or broadcast or whatever, or particularly online, now carries the burden of sorting fact from fiction. And, it's not that hard. You watch or you read something, if it's preposterous on the face of it, it's probably not true. So it's a matter of, as I say, media literacy, of applying a thought. When you see something extraordinary, particularly, I have to say, on a Fox News or something like that, you have to ask yourself, is this make sense? Is this really believable? But that burden has shifted as media have proliferated.
Here's another question. Reporters at the New York Times and in other news media seem to have greater license these days to work their opinions, or at least their analysis, into what used to be straight news stories. Why is that, and how do you feel about such a trend?
Well, it's very interesting. There are greater liberties taken today. One that catches my eye all the time, because it was forbidden, is the use of the first person, where the reporter on the scene will describe his or her experience in reporting the story.
There's a reason for that, which I can talk about, but go ahead. Yeah.
Well, I want to hear it, but my only point is, I actually like it.
Oh, good.
I think it is greater immediacy, and you get around the ridiculous things. In my father's day, he would write things like, I don't know, this observer asked a question, or whatever. I mean, it was preposterous. And I think it's much better. So that's it. As for opinion into the content, there is more, I think, to be honest. But very often it is informative. And I think papers like the New York Times and the Wall Street Journal and Washington Post and others do maintain a professionalism, and if not an objectivity, at least an independence. But I have to admit, they have a view, they have a perspective. The New York Times is an Eastern, urbane,
Right.
Big city newspaper, and they have a perspective on the world in their story selection and the way they cover things. So do the other papers as well. Everybody's got a perspective, and that comes through. What do you think?
Well, I agree with you. I mean, first of all, the reason that you see a little first person now that you didn't used to see it was a number of years ago. There was some studies done at the Times, and they asked readers, they saw a foreign course, they saw a person they were shown a picture of someone who was obviously a photographer in some sort of a foreign situation. And they said, who is this person? They said, oh, that person works for Vox. It was a Times correspondent. It turns out, because we can now learn this, no one has any idea what datelines mean, which is, New Delhi, Beirut, Jerusalem, those big things in capital letters at the start of a story. That means that the reporter is there. Well, people don't know that, it turns out. And it turns out that a lot of younger readers especially were unaware that the New York Times had the largest foreign staff, in the world almost. And that when we were reporting in these war zones or all over the world, people didn't think we were necessarily there. And, the kind of effort and money and care that goes into foreign, you were one of them, right? You know what we do at the Times. So there is a bit of that. And also you'll notice online that pictures run with the stories now, little mug shots of the correspondents.
Yes.
That's to let readers know that there are real people. I mean, it turns out that's not a given. And so it's part of reaching out to our readers and saying, we are there, we are on the scene, we are here to bear witness and to tell you about it. That's what that's about. I do also think, to say about opinion, I do think that when we were covering Donald Trump, we had heated, long discussions and debates about covering Trump. I won't go on too much, but it was not me, but it was Dean Baquet, our executive editor, who made the call when we said that the president lied. And you can't imagine saying that in an earlier era. Never.
No, absolutely not. And I will tell you,
this, and Democrats say that. But when you've got a president of the United States telling you and the world over and over again that he won the election, and it's not true, it is the responsibility of the New York Times to say this is not true.
right.
Otherwise,
I'm very much aware of that. And yet the word lie, to me, to my understanding, has, almost malice aforethought.
Right. We can go
it has a certain accent. So if you say untrue statement, that's a statement. I have no problem with that. Lie, I think that has an edge to it.
Implies intent. You know what's in the president's mind. And we went through this with Dean. And in his view, if Trump, when Trump said he had won the election, when he said that 3 million people voted illegally in the 2016 election, right. It was proven so false, and it was so widespread and proven false. There was no way the president believed it. I mean, it was, so you can argue with that, but I never had a problem with saying that Trump lied. I mean, do you think he thought he won the election? Maybe he thinks that now. It was always a debate we had. I used to talk to Peter Baker, our chief White House correspondent, about it. Do you think Trump actually believes this? And Peter would say, well, I think maybe not in the beginning, but he said it so many times, he's talked himself, who knows? It was always a debate. Anyway.
I think it becomes true for Trump. It becomes true, as Peter Baker was saying, as Maggie Haberman has illustrated. Anyway, I'm sorry.
So here, another question. This will, do you believe access journalism has diluted the profession? It's a question from an anonymous.
Well, it's nothing new.
No.
I mean, access journalism. Yeah, access is both vital to politicians, important figures, sports figures, entertainment figures. Access is vital, and it's very seductive. There's no question about it. And a professional has to keep his or her distance and head about them to remain independent. And it's very important. Access is gold in certain circumstances, but you'd better not drink too much of that beverage before you get in trouble.
So let me ask you this last question as we're winding up, which is you still are writing a column for the Capital Gazette?
No, my wife Susie
Oh, right.
became chief of staff to the mayor,
So
and the
that,
editor and I decided that that was a little too cozy,
right. Okay.
a little too cute. So
But-
I stopped it 3 years ago.
So the best question I have for you? So what is ahead for the next, the next decades for you, right? The next 50 years.
Well, what a wonderful thought. I
Right.
hope it includes a lot of golf and sailing, but I'm fascinated by the business that you are very much in right now, and following it and writing about it and being part of it, even on the periphery, is a perfectly good way for me to spend my time. And I intend to continue doing it.
That's great. I just want to say you came to visit the Times Washington Bureau at some point during the Trump era, in the last couple of years, and it was 10 or 11 in the morning, and you saw how busy it was because it was some 3-ring circus where we were doing our live briefing and our live blog and our live chat, and it was 11 in the morning. So that is what has changed.
I could hardly believe it.
I know.
I hardly believe it. Here
Like
were people like Peter Baker and Maggie Haberman and Michael Schmidt and others sitting in this big room covering live what was going on.
Yeah.
Putting it up.
So that is it.
I think Bradley is about
Thank you, Terry.
Join it. Hey, Elizabeth, thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, great moderating, Elizabeth. As a former foreign correspondent myself, I was fascinated and a little dismayed to hear about that survey saying many people didn't pay attention to datelines and realize reporters were actually writing.
It's horrifying if you've ever been anyplace overseas.
Oh my gosh, I'm so glad you and the Times are trying to address that. And Terry, you were mentioning in the green room before we began how the pandemic and being cooped up for months finally propelled you to write this memoir. And so that's definitely one very positive thing to have come out of this past period. And because now we have for posterity, a very engaging memoir about quite an extensive run that you had in both print and broadcast journalism. To everyone watching, thanks for tuning in. A reminder that in the chat column, you can find a link for purchasing copies of 4 Wars, 5 Presidents. From all of us here at Politics and Prose, stay well and well read.
Thank you.